Vladimir Putin has a problem he cannot solve with money, propaganda, or fear. There is no longer anywhere in Russia that is truly safe. Not Moscow, not St. Petersburg, not even the deep interior that Russian generations were raised to believe was untouchable. And the man who said this out loud on the record is Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. In an interview with the Financial Times on July 6th, Zelensky laid out a picture that should be sending chills through the Kremlin right now. He said the day is coming when hundreds of Ukrainian drones, not dozens, will appear over Moscow at once. And when that day comes, he said, Russia's ruling class, the untouchable elite who have spent this entire war insulated from the consequences of Putin's decisions, will feel something they have never had to feel before. Real fear. Fear for their own lives. And their only option, Zelensky suggested, will be to run. Not west, east, beyond the Ural Mountains. Here's the thing, this isn't some far-off hypothetical anymore, it's already happening, and the Kremlin's own officials are the ones confirming it. In March of 2026, Sergei Shoigu, once Russia's defense minister and now a senior security official, stood up in the city of Yekaterinburg, right in the heart of the Urals, and admitted something remarkable. He said, and I want you to really sit with this, that until recently the Urals were considered completely outside the range of Ukrainian strikes. Today, he admitted they are inside what he called the direct threat zone. Let that sink in. A senior Russian official standing in what was supposed to be Russia's last line of geographic safety just told the world that safety no longer exists. So what does Putin do when the map of safe Russia keeps shrinking? He starts moving his most prized possessions deeper and deeper into hiding. And the first thing on that list is his Air Force's crown jewel, the Su-57. If you followed Russian military propaganda at all over the last decade, you know the Su-57 is the plane Moscow has bragged about endlessly. It's marketed as a fifth-generation stealth fighter, the kind of aircraft that's supposed to represent the cutting edge of Russian engineering. Each one costs somewhere between $100 and $120 million. It's not just a weapon, it's a marketing tool, a flagship product Russia has tried to sell to the world as proof that its military technology can still compete on the global stage. So naturally, when Ukrainian drones started reaching further and further into Russian territory, the Kremlin did the obvious thing. It moved the Su-57 fleet to the Shagol Air Base near Chelyabinsk, roughly 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, deep in the Urals. The logic was simple. At that distance, nothing can touch them. That calculation failed spectacularly. In April of 2026, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces struck that exact base, the one that was supposed to be untouchable. Satellite imagery confirmed the damage. At least 2 Su-57s and 1 Su-34 strike aircraft were hit. On the very same day, Yekaterinburg, sitting even further east, came under attack for the first time in the entire war. Think about what that means for Russia. It's not just the loss of multi-million-dollar aircraft. It's the collapse of the entire story Russia has been telling its own people and the rest of the world. The idea that there was a place their most advanced weapons could hide. That idea just died on Russian soil in front of everyone. And it wasn't only fighter jets that had to run. Russia's transport aircraft, the unglamorous cargo planes like the Il-76, the An-24, and the An-22, had to be relocated too. These aircraft don't get the headlines, but they are the backbone that keeps Russia's entire war machine supplied. No army stays powerful if its supply lines collapse. So these fleets got pulled from their traditional bases in western Russia and pushed east as well. Satellite images tell the story clearly. The Seshcha Air Base, which used to host large numbers of Il-76 cargo planes, is now practically empty of them. What's left behind are mostly the slower, older An-22s. And even the aircraft that remain don't get to sit still. They're being moved almost daily now, just to avoid becoming the next target. The same fate hit Russia's strategic bombers, the Tu-95s and Tu-160 that have been raining cruise missiles down on Ukrainian cities for years. After the shock of Ukraine's spiderweb operation, these bombers were pulled all the way to the Far East, as far from the front line as Russian geography allows. And here's where it gets almost comedic in a dark way, because moving planes isn't enough. Russia has also had to build brand new reinforced concrete shelters since the fall of 2024 at a minimum of 14 air bases within Ukrainian strike range. Why? Because the old Soviet-era shelters were built for smaller aircraft. Modern jets like the Su-34 and Su-35 literally don't fit inside them, so Russia spends a fortune building these new shelters, and Ukraine finds a way to defeat them anyway. How? Ukrainian drones, now capable of carrying up to 200 kilograms of explosives, target the steel blast doors directly. Even when the drone doesn't punch through the concrete itself, the blast pressure at the door is enough to do catastrophic damage. The explosion tears fragments from the inside of the concrete structure, turning the shelter itself into a storm of secondary shrapnel that shreds whatever aircraft is sitting inside. We've already seen this play out. At the Saki Air Base in occupied Crimea, satellite imagery showed 6 out of 7 shelters damaged, 4 of them with their steel blast doors ripped clean off and thrown forward by the force of the explosion. A nearly identical scene played out at the Marinovka base in Volgograd, where shelter after shelter containing aircraft was struck in sequence. So here's the trap Russia finds itself in, and there's no clean way out of it. Almost all of these hardened shelters were built at western and southern bases because that's where the threat was assumed to be concentrated near the front lines. The deep interior, the Urals, Siberia relied on a completely different kind of protection, distance. For decades, distance was the shield. Nobody bothered building expensive shelters out there because nobody believed anything could reach that far. Ukraine's spiderweb operation, which struck the Belaya air base deep in Siberia, shattered that assumption completely. The shield of distance doesn't work anymore, and Russia is now paying an enormous compounding price just to keep its most valuable assets alive. Let's talk about what that price actually looks like, because the numbers here are staggering. Take the Su-34, Russia's frontline strike aircraft. With a full weapons load, its combat radius, meaning how far it can fly out, strike, and return, is about 1,100 kilometers. Flying out of a base near the Ukrainian border, like Lipetsk, that's a comfortable range to reach the front and complete a mission. But now, pull that same aircraft back 1,700 kilometers into the Urals to keep it safe from drones. Suddenly, the math falls apart entirely. Every single mission now requires covering distances the aircraft was never designed for in one comfortable trip. That means airborne refueling, extra fuel tanks, dramatically longer flight times, and fuel consumption that skyrockets per sortie. And here's the ripple effect that really hurts Russia. The value of any combat aircraft is measured by its sortie rate, how often it can fly and strike in a given day. A jet flying out of a frontline base might fly multiple missions daily. A jet flying from a base 1,700 kilometers back might manage a fraction of that because each mission now eats up hours instead of a quick turnaround. Add in the constant relocations these aircraft need just to avoid being found, and every move disrupts maintenance schedules, munitions resupply, and crew readiness. In other words, Russia doesn't even need to lose a single additional aircraft in combat for this strategy to be working. Simply forcing these planes to run and hide over and over again is quietly grinding down Russian air power from the inside. Think about what that actually means for a country trying to sustain a full-scale war. Every jet that used to fly 3 or 4 sorties a day from a forward base might now manage 1, if that. Multiply that across dozens of aircraft across months, and you start to see an air force that looks intact on paper. The planes still exist, the pilots are still trained, but functions at a fraction of its real strength. It's death by 1,000 relocations, not a single knockout blow. And now here's the part that should be keeping Kremlin planners up at night. All of this extra fuel burn is happening at the exact moment Russia is dealing with one of the worst fuel crises of the entire war. Ukraine's months-long campaign against Russian oil refineries has significantly cut into the country's fuel production. In some Russian regions, ordinary citizens are struggling to find gasoline at the pump. In others, actual formal fuel rationing has been introduced, meaning regular Russian families, not soldiers, not generals, regular people, are being told how much gas they're allowed to buy. Now connect the dots. The jet fuel burning through these relocated aircraft comes from the exact same refineries Ukraine has been hitting. So Russia is now forced to burn more and more of a resource that is already critically scarce, just to keep its planes running from base to stay alive. Every single relocation weakens Russia's combat capability and drains its already strained resources at the same time. It's a downward spiral with no obvious exit. Here's something that makes this whole situation even stranger. What's happening right now has actually happened once before in Russian history, 80 years ago, during Russia's darkest days. Back in 1941, when Nazi Germany's armies were closing in on Moscow, Stalin prepared a secret decree to relocate the entire Soviet capital eastward. The city of Kuibyshev, known today as Samara, sitting 1,100 kilometers east of Moscow, was quietly designated as the reserve capital of the Soviet Union. At the same time, thousands of factories were evacuated deep into the Urals. Cities like Chelyabinsk earned the nickname Tankograd, Tank City, because of the sheer volume of tank production that got relocated there. What ultimately saved the Soviet Union in that moment was exactly this: geographic depth the Germans simply couldn't reach. So why does history suddenly feel like it's repeating itself? Because Zelensky's vision for Putin today is almost a mirror image of Stalin's plan back then. But there's one massive difference that changes absolutely everything. In 1941, that depth was truly untouchable. The Germans had no way to strike that far east. Today, Ukraine's drones, built at a fraction of the cost of a fighter jet, can reach even the deepest corners of the Urals and Siberia. The safety net that saved Russia once before simply doesn't exist anymore. And this brings us to what might be the real genius behind Zelensky's entire strategy, because destroying a few aircraft or a couple of refineries was never really the ultimate goal. The real target is something much harder to measure, but arguably far more dangerous for Putin: the psychological illusion that Russia, and specifically its capital and its ruling elite, are untouchable. Putin's grip on power rests heavily on an image of total control and total security. For an average Russian citizen, or for a wealthy Kremlin-connected businessman, Moscow has always represented an untouchable fortress, safely removed from the actual war. Every single drone that reaches deeper into Russian territory puts another crack in that fortress wall. And the question that starts forming in people's minds is a dangerous one for any authoritarian regime. If the state can't even protect its own capital and can't even protect its own elite, can it actually win this war at all? That psychological wound cuts far deeper than any single lost aircraft ever could. It attacks the very foundation of Putin's legitimacy and the sense of security his entire regime is built on selling to the Russian people. History actually gives us a strikingly similar example of exactly how devastating this kind of psychological blow can be. Shortly after Pearl Harbor in 1942, the United States launched the famous Doolittle raid. 16 American bombers reached Tokyo and struck the Japanese capital. In terms of pure physical damage, the raid barely mattered. It was almost negligible. But psychologically, it was an earthquake. Up until that moment, both the Japanese public and its military leadership genuinely believed their home islands were completely untouchable. That single raid shattered that myth instantly. Japanese military commanders were so rattled by it that they rushed into the Midway operation, a hasty, poorly conceived strategic gamble that led directly to one of the most decisive defeats in Japanese naval history just 6 weeks later. Zelensky's vision of 1,000 drones over Moscow follows that exact same logic. The goal was never really to level cities. The goal is to destroy the feeling of safety inside the minds of Russia's people and its elite. And once that feeling cracks, it opens up a far more dangerous and far less predictable question. What does a cornered Vladimir Putin actually do next? This is genuinely the most unpredictable part of the entire situation, because nobody, not analysts, not intelligence agencies, not even people inside the Kremlin, can say for certain how a leader whose illusion of invincibility has just collapsed will respond. But there are two possibilities on the table right now, and both of them are frightening in completely different ways. The first and the most terrifying is escalation. If Putin comes to see these deep strikes as a genuine existential threat to his own regime, he may reach for the most destructive card he has left: nuclear rhetoric, and we've seen this exact playbook before. Back in the fall of 2022, when Ukraine was making rapid gains through a counteroffensive, Putin openly threatened the West with nuclear weapons and stated flatly that he wasn't bluffing. Figures like Dmitry Medvedev pushed those threats even further in public statements. But here's what actually happened. Russia quietly withdrew from Kherson despite what it had called its own red lines being crossed, and it never touched those weapons. Even during the 2025 Spiderweb operation, when Ukraine struck Russia's strategic bombers on its own home soil, the nuclear response everyone braced for never came. British historian Lawrence Freedman has pointed out that Putin appears to reserve the nuclear option for a genuinely existential moment, not for battlefield setbacks, however humiliating. So while these threats are absolutely frightening on paper, history so far shows they've mostly remained exactly that: threats. Still, the risk of miscalculation by a leader who feels cornered can never be fully ruled out. The second possibility might actually be more realistic, and it doesn't come from outside Russia at all. It comes from within Putin's own inner circle. This is where that collapsing illusion of invincibility becomes truly dangerous for Putin personally. And this isn't just theory. The short-lived internal mutiny in the summer of 2023 was the most serious internal challenge to Putin's power in years. And it revealed something crucial. Russia's massive nuclear arsenal couldn't protect Putin from a threat that came from inside his own system. Putin's grip on power has always depended on his ability to guarantee wealth, protection, and security to the elites surrounding him. The moment those same elites start to feel that even their own mansions, their own families aren't safe anymore, that entire loyalty arrangement becomes unstable. And Russian history backs this up. Russian leaders have far more often been toppled by discontent inside their own court than by defeat on any battlefield. From the 1917 revolution that ended Tsar Nicholas II's rule to the quiet palace coup that removed Khrushchev in 1964, Putin obviously still maintains an iron grip over his security services. But as the pressure from these deep strikes continues to build, the odds of some kind of internal fracture only grow stronger. Neither of these two scenarios is guaranteed, and they're not mutually exclusive either. Nuclear escalation is terrifying, but history suggests it's mostly bluff so far. A palace-style power struggle is logical, but Putin's control over his own security apparatus makes it genuinely difficult to pull off. Yet both possibilities share one deeply unsettling truth. When a regime starts to feel like it has nothing left to lose, the entire world becomes a far more dangerous place. Now, before anyone gets too optimistic about where this is heading, we have to be honest about something important. Despite everything we've just laid out, Russia still has serious resources and a genuinely stubborn capacity to keep fighting. It would be a mistake to assume these deep strikes alone are going to bring Russia to its knees anytime soon. For one thing, Russia is adapting while it runs. This is not the same clumsy, disorganized army we saw in the earliest days of the invasion. It's absorbing every new Ukrainian tactic and building its own countermeasures in response. In the summer of 2024, Russia stood up a specialized unmanned technology center called Rubicon, specifically designed to catch up in drone warfare. Its entire focus is hunting down Ukrainian drone operator teams and jamming their electronic systems within roughly 10 to 40 kilometers of the front line. Russia also formed a new unmanned systems brigade, the 50th, reporting directly to its general staff, dedicated entirely to deep strike operations. Its air defenses are also still functioning at a meaningful level. During one of Ukraine's largest drone barrages targeting Moscow directly, Russian air defense units claim to have shot down the overwhelming majority of the incoming drones, even though the intended refinery target still ended up getting hit. That tells you the layered defense system, while clearly not perfect, is still doing real work. None of this means the pressure isn't real. It means the pressure is a slow bleed, not a knockout punch. And slow bleeds can still be fatal over time. They just don't show up as a single dramatic headline. That's actually part of what makes this moment so hard to read from the outside. There's no single battle, no single explosion that tells us definitively which way this is heading. Instead, we're watching two exhausted systems, Russian resilience on one side and Ukrainian persistence on the other, grinding against each other in real time. Second, and this might be the most important point of all, Russia's war machine is still producing weapons despite years of sanctions and battlefield losses. Russia has pushed defense spending to levels not seen since the Soviet era. Production of the Su-34 strike aircraft, the same jet we talked about losing earlier in this story, has roughly doubled to about 30 new aircraft per year. Existing contracts already call for dozens more deliveries by 2027. The exact same pattern applies to missiles and drones. In October of 2025 alone, Russia fired nearly 150 ballistic missiles in a single month, one of the highest totals of the entire war. Producing thousands of attack drones every month has now become Russia's new normal. Third, we need to keep the actual strategic impact of these strikes in honest perspective. Yes, the attacks on Russian refineries are straining the economy in a real measurable way, but independent estimates suggest they've only affected somewhere between 10 and 17% of Russia's total refining capacity. That's meaningful damage. It is not by any stretch the kind of collapse that forces the Kremlin to abandon the war. And finally, Ukraine has its own serious vulnerabilities in this equation. Zelensky himself has openly admitted that Ukraine remains dependent on Western-supplied Patriot air defense systems, and the stockpiles of those systems are steadily shrinking. That's the single most important limiting factor standing between Ukraine and being able to defend its own skies from Russian ballistic missiles. And of course, hanging over the entire situation is Russia's nuclear card, still on the table, still the single most dangerous unknown in this entire war. So while the psychological and strategic edge Ukraine has clearly built up here is real, turning that edge into an actual decisive victory depends entirely on two things: relentless, sustained battlefield pressure, and continued uninterrupted support from the West. Without both of those, this advantage could stall out. Still, Russia's forced retreat toward the Urals tells its own story loudly. It is, right now, the single clearest sign we have that momentum in this war is shifting toward Ukraine, which means the actual outcome of this war isn't only being decided on the front line anymore, it's being decided in the skies over Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the more control Putin loses over that sky, the closer his last possible place to hide gets to disappearing entirely. So here's the question nobody in the Kremlin wants to answer out loud. What happens when Vladimir Putin finally runs out of places left to run? Drop your take in the comments below. Do you think this ends in escalation, or does it end with someone inside Putin's own circle deciding enough is enough? We're going to keep following this story as it develops, so make sure you're subscribed to States Report so you don't miss the next update.